Today we're going to finish up our own missionary journey through Acts. Starting in chapter 21, we left chapter 20 with Paul saying goodbye to the people in Ephesus. And let's pick right up. I got the outline out there, and I still have the link to that map website in the description, so you can check that. So let's go right to it, to 21. So Paul left Ephesus, and then it says, so Luke is with them again. They torn themselves away from them. They set out, made a straight run, blah, blah, blah. They went to all these places, and this again shows that Luke is not trying to hide anything. He's trying to be a thorough historian, and he's giving these details that helps us to know that this is an ordinary historical account that's as reliable as any other. And we can also, we have these maps because of this stuff. It isn't just that somebody said they got on board a spaceship and suddenly appeared at this weird place, and all these stories that are always sound so factual because they're well told, but there's no evidence for it that anyone can see. And so people who prefer to believe other stories on the basis of really nothing but imagination will decide that that's true, and that accounts that are boring and ordinary and traceable like this must certainly be false. As everything, the quote-unquote thinking of people today is just completely upside down and backwards. There's a story, for example, of some people, I forget the names because it just wasn't that important to me, who allegedly, some Norse people, a man and his son who went to the far North Pole and found some giants there in this story. And, who knows what's going on at either of the poles, where the vast majority of people have never been. And so people make up stories to try to fill in blanks, and they have to be very different from any other stories, and then those are declared true on the basis of their being different and having a good storyline for something that we can't yet investigate, while factual, traceable Bible accounts like these are dismissed as myth. So the people who say those things are just, being completely irrational, and I've been doing enough videos on that. I won't go into that. So let's move on. What's going on actually in the real world that's traceable here. So they found disciples at Tyre. Tyre and Sidon are very famous ancient cities. And they found disciples there, and they stayed for 7 days, and they told Paul through the Spirit not to get on board for Jerusalem. So when the ship was ready, they're sailing up and down the coast of the Mediterranean there. And they got on the ship and went away and stayed with some other believers. And then they went to Caesarea, where they found Philip. And we met Philip before, where he was harpazoed, snatched, when he met the Ethiopian official and baptized him, and then suddenly found himself snatched away to someplace else. So this is that same Philip, and I'm going to learn a little bit more about him. But he lived in Caesarea at this time, and it says the gospel proclaimer who was one of the 7. So there was apparently a group of 7 aside from or partially from the 12 disciples. So there's a 7, and Philip was one of these, and he was a proclaimer of the gospel. And people, again, get hung up on this word preacher, as if only certain people can do this. But the fact is that every Christian is supposed to preach the gospel. That's what preaching is. It's proclamation. It's spreading good news and announcing it to people. And anyone who is saved has that same message and can make that pronouncement. There's no reason that you have to have someone's approval other than the Holy Spirit to do such a thing. And even then, as Paul had said in one of his letters, there were some people who preached the gospel out of envy or greed, and he didn't care as long as the gospel they preached was true and accurate. So the message was more important than the person. And yet, of course, as Christians, it's more important to make sure we know who the fakes are. But in this case, especially where we have the word preaching again, we have to make sure that we don't immediately supply the meaning, the baggage of preacher as tradition has had it. Anyway, he was someone who went all over the place preaching, so he was a missionary, and he was one of this group of 7, whatever they were. We don't have much information. So Luke and Paul and them stayed with Philip there for a while, and this is where it says in 21:9, Philip, had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. So whatever Philip was doing is also, and here we need to understand the difference between prophecy and priesthood. A priest represents the people to God. Okay, they bring sacrifices or whatnot from the people to God. Okay, but a prophet goes the opposite way. They have a message from God to the people. So every Christian has that message. Every Christian has the Holy Spirit, and every Christian is supposed to be spreading the gospel. And so this is what prophecy is, but it also, so if you're speaking a message from God, you are prophesying, but there's also a special sense of it that we see by context where someone has a specific message from God beyond the general message of the gospel. And so here again, with context, you have to look at it to see what's going on. And to point out that these 7 unmarried daughters of Philip were prophets certainly means more than just they spread the gospel like every other Christian. Okay, so I'm just trying to define terms here, but these 4 unmarried women were speaking for God to people in a way that was unusual or set apart in some way from the general preaching that all Christians are supposed to do. So this was, in that sense, authoritative, and we have to remember as Christians that all authority comes not from the person who's speaking, but from the Spirit who supplies it. And so anyone who tries to make a big deal about speaking authoritatively is saying, in most cases, what they mean is the person in their flesh has authority, but that's not true at all. All authority comes from God, and God is not a respecter of persons, and the flesh is irrelevant. So when somebody tries to make a big deal about certain people cannot have authority because of their flesh, they don't understand the gospel. They don't understand the church. They don't understand that all power and all authority is vested in Jesus, who said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples. Given to him, not to any pastor, preacher, CEO. Anyway, enough of that rant. So this Philip guy, one of the 7, who was a missionary, had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. And after Luke and the rest of them stayed there a few days, there was another prophet, okay, listed right after the unmarried daughter prophets of Philip, whose name was Agabus, came down from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and he took Paul's belt and bound his own hands and feet with it and said, this is what the Holy Spirit says. The owner of this belt will be bound in this manner by the Judeans in Jerusalem, and they will hand him over to the non-Judeans. So he was given a special word of knowledge from God to Paul. Okay, and here again, listed in the same context as these other women prophets. And what did this prophet do? Thus saith the Lord, basically, to borrow the common Middle English phrase. Thus saith the Lord. This is what the Holy Spirit says. So this is what these daughters were doing as well, and they had better, and anybody else, a daughter or son today in the church having the Holy Spirit can say the same thing. But I think my personal opinion about a lot of people saying that God told them something, they're being very fast and loose with those terms, because a lot of times it's just a person's vivid imagination, especially it comes with matters of prophecy, and especially the timing of Jesus' return. People think they have messages from God all the time. It gets ridiculous, and to the point where even some of these date-setting message boards have had to ban people or tell them, look, you don't go to heaven every day. Jesus doesn't take you on a tour every day. And, we're tired of hearing, constant stream of stories about visions of heaven and things because, A, we don't believe them anymore because nobody does this, and B, it's just, we're not about that. We're not about, an endless string of personal revelations. We're here to study prophecy in the Bible. So even they had their limits. And I remember a few years back, there was a story supposedly of this atheist who was taken to heaven and had a tour, and it described everything in great detail, and it was all so awesome, and all the Christians fell for it. This was maybe 5 years ago, I'm guessing. I don't remember for sure. But there were red flags all over the place. There's only 2 people in the entire New Testament who were taken to heaven, and only one was allowed to talk about it. Paul was one of those people. He said he was taken up to the 3rd heaven and was not allowed to say what he saw there and heard there. The only other one was John, who's given the revelation. And even then, there were certain things he was not allowed to say. So these people, especially an atheist, that's the B part of that, is that if God doesn't let hardly any of his own people come to heaven while they're still in the mortal flesh, then what about this atheist? Why would God do that? And of course, every such story has the person telling it being someone special that God picked out for a certain mission. So those are red flags we need to look for. And this all was prompted by the text here about prophecy and about someone named Agabus in this case, who had a specific prophecy for Paul. So we have to be very discerning. We have to test the spirits, as the Apostle John said, because we have the Bible to use as our measuring rod, so that as Paul taught, that 1 or 2 prophets should speak and the others should weigh what is said. So we need to have more than one person interpreting another person's claims and discuss it. And that's how God is working through the congregations. That's just, that's the teaching we have. So anyway, there was a specific prophecy made about Paul, about him being bound in Jerusalem. And in 2112, interesting number there, when we heard this, we and the locals pleaded with Paul not to go to Jerusalem, but Paul responded, "Why are you doing this to me, crying and breaking my heart? I'm ready to not only be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the sake of the name of Master Jesus." When we could not dissuade him, we quieted down and said, "May the will of the Master be done." So they had to resign themselves to Paul's resolve not to go there. I mean, the prophet didn't say don't go in this case, although in other cases that had happened. He was just saying, you're going to go, and when you do, this is going to happen. So anyway, after that, it says, we packed our bags, went to Jerusalem, and some disciples from Caesarea came along with us. They took us to stay with Mnason, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, a Cyprian who had been a disciple from the beginning. Some people will read that and go, Mason! Absolute irrational nonsense. Anyway, he had been a disciple from the beginning, so this was a seasoned believer, and it says, we were warmly greeted by believers in Jerusalem. So far, so good. But that never lasts. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders came as well. And after greeting them, Paul retold each detail in order concerning all the things God had done among the non-Judeans through his service. So another missionary journey report. Okay, and then in verse 20, those who heard this gave honor to God, but then they said, you are aware, brother, that tens of thousands of Judeans have believed, yet they are still very dedicated to the law. See, we're still in our transition period. The temple was still functioning in the priesthood, etc. It says, they have heard about you, that you teach all the Judeans and other nations to depart from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or keep their traditions. Which is true, but they have a dilemma to deal with, and this is again where Paul's principle of being all things to all people comes in, and it's going to have unforeseen consequences. Anyway, they said, what are we to do about this, since they will surely find out you have come? Follow our instructions. There are 4 men here who have taken a vow. Take them along and join in their purification ritual and pay to have their heads shaved. So Paul had done this before. Okay, and I made a slight reference to it, but this is a different instance where Paul is having, whatever this vow is something Paul has done himself before. But he's saying there's 4 other people who are going to take this vow. So you not only take them, go along with them, you pay for it. And then everyone will know that there's nothing to what they've heard about you since you strictly observe the law. So these people were still very much, especially living in Jerusalem, concerned with Christians having a good reputation with the Jews. And then they go on, as for the non-Judean believers, we have written them a letter instructing them to stay away from idol sacrifice, referring again to Acts 15, where they had that Jerusalem council, from eating animals with blood still in them or that had been strangled, and from promiscuity. So These are the same Christians who said, don't put Gentiles under the law, but we asked them to make concessions out of being sensitive to the Jewish culture so as not to cause too much trouble. So they were being consistent with what they had decided at that council that Paul was at, remember, and he took that message along with some others to the Gentiles who were, being told that they had to become Jews, basically. And then the decision was no, and it's still no. Because people will read this out of context and forgetting what past history had gone on with all these people and saying that Paul was obeying the laws of Moses and that, look, all these other believers are still obeying the laws of Moses, and so therefore the church must obey the laws of Moses. And we're like, no. And, there's a lot of a gazillion other reasons why not that we've already been over. So anyway, keeping this incident in its context of trying to placate the Jews so there isn't too much trouble, okay? So Paul did what they said. He took them in the next day and purified himself along with them. Then he entered the temple compound to record the completion date of the purification period. So this stuff was legally binding, and he made an offering for each one of them. And then it says, when the 7 days were nearly over, Judeans from the province of Asia spotted him in the temple compound. They agitated the crowd by taking hold of Paul and yelling, "People of Israel, help us. This is the one who spreads teachings to everyone everywhere against our people, against the law in this place. And what's more, he brought non-Judeans into the temple compound and has contaminated the sacred place." Talk about jumping to conclusions and guilt by association and guilt by total misunderstanding of the people around. And then there's a little parenthesis that Luke adds. Earlier, they had seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they presumed Paul had taken him into the temple compound. So Paul did no such thing. They just made a presumption, and they were on a hair trigger to assign Paul guilt because they didn't like even the smell of somebody saying, don't obey the laws of Moses. So once again, the whole city was in an uproar, and the people formed a mob. This was Paul's usual experience everywhere he went, and now it's happening in Jerusalem. They seized Paul and removed him from the temple compound, then quickly locked the gates. While they were trying to kill him, a report reached the commander of the garrison that all of Jerusalem was in turmoil. So he took soldiers and legion commanders down to them immediately. When the mob saw them, they stopped beating Paul. So they were going to kill him, but somebody reported to the authorities who came down to stop the insurrection or whatever was going on, because that's what Romans did, and they were occupying Israel. So then it says down in, let me scroll down here, 33. Then the legion commander approached Paul and took custody of him and having him bound with 2 chains. So there's the fulfillment of the prophecy. And then it says that he demanded to know who he was and what he had done. So he bound him first and arrested him and then said, "What did you do? And who are you?" That's how they, shoot first, ask questions later. But the mob shouted conflicting things, as mobs tend to do. So because he couldn't figure out what was going on, he ordered Paul to be taken to the citadel. When he reached the stairway, the soldiers had to carry him because the mob had become too violent, and they followed along shouting, "Put him to death." As the footnote says, away with him. That means to have him executed. That's what people were saying. They weren't saying just get him out of town. They're saying put him to death. They had learned nothing at all from what happened to Jesus. So anyway, usual, ordinary experiences of Paul. And then it says, as he was about to be taken into the citadel, Paul asked the legion commander, "May I have a word with you?" And then he said, "You speak Greek?" He responded, "So you must not be the Egyptian who led an insurrection some time ago and took 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness." This is interesting, isn't it? Not only was Paul speaking Greek, he was mistaken for an Egyptian. Okay? So what about the black Hebrew Israelite theory? Just to interject that here. Egyptians don't look like Southern African blacks. They're brown-skinned, but they're not African, quote-unquote, looking as in certain other physical features. Egyptians are distinguishable from other Africans, and not the least of which is that, not every African is the same shade of brown, just like all human beings are different shades of the same shade of brown. They're just different amounts of melanin, and white people just have less of it, and there are black people to the other extreme who are really black and not even a shade of brown anymore. They look black. And I'm told somewhere that Ethiopian means men with burnt faces, that they were that dark. Well, Egyptians are not that dark, and most who claim to be black Hebrew Israelites are not that dark. They're different shades too. So what are they going to do after they, try to demonize all the whites? They're going to turn on each other as being too light-skinned. They're going to do it. Anyway, the point here is that Paul was mistaken for an Egyptian. He looked like an Egyptian. Didn't walk like one. He looked little tiny 70s joke there, or 80s, whatever that was, that song, Walk Like an Egyptian. So the guy was surprised that Paul was speaking Greek and that he wasn't an Egyptian. Okay. And and Paul answers, I am in fact a Judean from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. Paul replied, so please let me speak to the people. And the guy granted permission. So Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when they had completely settled down, he began his speech to them in the Hebrew dialect. Okay, so they're calling Hebrew a dialect, which is interesting. And the fact is that people were, Paul was speaking Greek. And so here again, it touches on the issue. We saw just how it touches on the issue of Black Hebrew Israelite movement. And now we're seeing how it touches on the issue of what language the New Testament was originally written in. And I've gone all over that on my website and on a little bit on the language video that I did a long time ago. But the fact is that there is no manuscript in any language but Greek that predates it, any part of the gospel. So people were speaking Greek. That was the international language. The Roman soldier was speaking Greek and not Italian or Latin. And he was surprised that Paul was not an Egyptian. Those are the things I'm getting out of this so far. So he's going to speak to his own people in a Hebrew dialect. Now, what does that mean? Some people think it means actual Hebrew, but it says dialect here, which kind of lends its support to the idea that people were speaking Aramaic, which is well supported at that, historically and secularly, that people were speaking Aramaic for the most part. It is related to Hebrew, but it is not technically full Hebrew. So it's a dialect. A dialect is more, looking at the chat, a little bit different than just an accent. I mean, even in English in America, we have different accents. We have Southern accents, Eastern accents, Western ones. So a dialect is a little bit different language. Sometimes significantly, sometimes not so much. Like there's, I'm told, a significant difference between Spanish and Portuguese, even though they sound to us pretty much the same. People who are speaking those two different languages, they are one, a language and a dialect, that they are enough different to get that label on them. And just on the topic of dialects, before I go to the next chapter, there was someone named Robert Wilson. I forget, I think he lived in the 40s or 50s or something like that in the US, who by the time he finished college could read the New Testament in 9 languages. He was obviously gifted, and he determined by looking at the average length of lifespan of his ancestry that he would live another 45 years. And he divided up after he finished college, divided up his plan of the rest of his life into 3 sections of 15 years each. The first 15 he would spend learning every Semitic language that had anything to do with the Bible. And he did so, and by the time he was done, he had learned 45 languages and dialects, and that's why I tied that in there, the dialect word. 45 languages and dialects mastered. He could recite the entire Old Testament in Hebrew by syllable by syllable. The guy had a phenomenal memory and a gift of language. Then he spent the next 15 years doing research, 15 years researching directly in the languages and not relying on anyone to translate. And then the last 15 years writing about his research. And that's exactly how his life played out. And so these are the kinds of people and with the kinds of talents and motivations that have brought us the Bible. Not to say he was perfect and infallible and right about everything, but when it came to his area of expertise, he was the man. And I had met people in message boards who were taught by him. So this was a real person and real talent and real gifting, and these are concrete evidences that support our confidence in the Bible. So let me go on now to chapter 22. do want to get done today. And it says, Paul's speech here, and he says, folks, brothers and sisters, parents, listen now to my defense. Now, when they heard him speaking in the Hebrew dialect, they became very still, and he continued, because they expected him, he was some foreigner doing, Gentile things in the temple. And so they were very surprised to hear him speak. And then he says, I am a Judean man, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but raised in this city under the strict training of Gamaliel, I messed that up, Gamaliel, who we met earlier, didn't we, when Peter and, was it John, Peter and James, or Peter and John, I think it was before the Sanhedrin, and they were trying to decide what to do with them. And Gamaliel stood up before them and calmed them down and advised them not to punish them, because he gave a little history about why that shouldn't be done, because they might find themselves fighting against God and so forth. That's this guy, okay? Paul, this is where Paul says, that's my mentor, my trainer in the Pharisees. This was my teacher, okay? So he goes on to say concerning the ancestral law, so he was taught about the law by this guy. He says, I was very enthusiastic for God, as all of you are today. I persecuted this way, the church, the Christians, to the point of death, capturing both men and women to be handed over and jailed. The ruling priest can attest to this. So he was still alive, along with the group of elders from whom I received letters to their associates in Damascus, which authorized me to arrest any I found there and take them to Jerusalem to be punished. Okay, so now he's going to retell his experience, and he's not going to use exact same wording that Luke used in describing it earlier. It says, now it happened that as I came, and he's going to tell this one more time when he's on trial before, I think it's Festus, we'll meet him later. Now it happened that as I came near Damascus at around noon, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed all around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, sir? I asked. I am Jesus the Nazarene, he said. He replied, the one you are persecuting. Those who had accompanied me did see the light, but they didn't hear the voice of the one speaking to me. And this is where people nitpick about the details. So I asked, what must I do, sir? And the reply was, get up and go in Damascus. There you will be told everything you are assigned to do. So the story adds up. The details about what the others with him saw or heard are more so here when Paul is speaking than when Luke related it in the earlier account when it actually happened, because Luke was just narrating at that point, okay? But Paul is telling himself, first person, what had happened. And he says that the others with him saw the light, but didn't hear the voice. Now, didn't hear doesn't mean they didn't hear a sound. It means that they didn't understand what it was saying, okay? So you can take it both ways. There's enough ambiguity in the Greek to give you that. So this is not what people think is a hard and fast contradiction. Anyway, we'll get back to that later, I think, in the other account. And then he says, everything else is exactly the same, that Paul is struck down on his way to Damascus to kill Christians, and he's told to wait for instructions and so forth. And then Paul says, I could see nothing because of the brilliance of the light, and my companions led me by the hand into Damascus. Now there was a certain Ananias, a devout observer of the law, and well regarded by all the Judeans living there. He came and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight, and right away I could see him. Then he added, the God of our ancestors has already chosen you to know his will, to perceive the righteous one, and to hear what he has to say. Already chosen you, the Calvinists jump on, ignore the rest of scriptures, and take it completely out of context and say that, Paul was chosen for salvation. But here again, God knows whose heart is open and whose isn't. In spite of all appearances that in Paul's direction he was going, God has a way of getting your attention. This is what some of us call 2x4 counseling, where God has to hit you with a 2x4 to get your attention. So that's all that's going on here. Paul was not chosen against his will, not rejuvenated. What's the word the Calvinists use? Quickened or whatever. Anyway, there was another R word I couldn't think of, but it says, Paul is saying, the God of our ancestors has already chosen you to know his will, to perceive the righteous one, to hear what he has to say, because you will bear witness for him to all people about what you've seen and heard. So now, what are you waiting for? Get up and be immersed, wash away your failures, and call on his name. So here again, he's giving the details of his own personal experience, speaking to the angry mob who had finally quieted down because they heard him speak in Hebrew, or in a dialect, which could have been Aramaic. Okay, so they've heard him up to this point. Everything is cool, but it's about to turn sour. Paul goes on, when I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple compound and fell into a trance, and I saw him speaking to me, leave Jerusalem immediately because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Master, they know very well that I was jailing and punishing those in every synagogue. So Paul's supplying detail that Luke did not supply earlier, who had put their trust in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was shed, I was standing there giving my full approval, this part we know, and also guarding the clothing of those who executed him. But he said to me, go, I am sending you, and here's where the trouble starts, far away to the non-Judeans. Trigger word, Gentiles. They listened to him until he said that and then shouted, rid the earth of someone like that. He is not fit to live. Never mind everything else he said. They were cool with that. But as soon as he said Gentile, they just turned into an angry mob again. Then as they were shouting, flinging off their outer clothing and throwing dust in the air, the legion commander ordered that he be taken into the citadel. He was to be interrogated under flogging in order to determine the reason for their reaction. So they didn't understand what was being said because they didn't understand the Hebrew dialect. Apparently they did know Greek, but they said, here he was speaking on the steps of the citadel, and all of a sudden the people went berserk. And so he said, well, he must be guilty of something, so we'll just proceed with what we were going to do. And then it says, as they were strapping him down for the flogging, Paul asked the Roman army captain standing there, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen without a trial? So here's Paul again using his credentials as a citizen of Rome to get himself out of trouble. Just something to keep in mind when we face various gray areas as Christians in a very bad society, which certainly Rome was as well. But it had some ways it was better than what we have today. Anyway, when the Roman army captain heard this, he went to the legion commander and says, what are you doing? This is a Roman citizen, as if he knew. He just found out. People have a way of covering themselves when they find out they're in trouble. And we'll see a little bit more of that. It's kind of funny, but anyway, the legion commander went over to Paul and asked, is it true that you're a Roman citizen? And yes, Paul replied. And the commander said, I paid a huge amount of money to become a citizen. But Paul said, I was born a citizen. And immediately those who were about to question him withdrew from him. And the legion commander was afraid because he had taken a Roman citizen into custody. The next day, the legion commander, determined to find out what Paul was actually being accused of by the Judeans, released him and ordered the ruling priests and the whole Sanhedrin to convene. Then he took Paul there to stand before them. So once again, Paul is going to be put before the Sanhedrin. Okay, and the Roman commander doesn't know what's going on, but he's trying to find out at least. Okay, so now let's go on to 23. Excuse me. And Paul faced the Sanhedrin and said, folks, brothers and sisters, I have lived in good conscience as a citizen before God to this day. So just opening remarks. But the ruling priest Ananias, again, not the same one who was dropped dead among the Christians, more than several chapters back, ordered those standing near him to punch him in the mouth. Just for saying hello, basically. And then Paul says, God is about to beat you, you whitewashed wall. Ooh, it's escalating now in a hurry. He said, you sit in judgment of me according to the law, but you broke the law by having me punched. So he's saying this to the high priest. Okay? The high priest Ananias, he called him a whitewashed wall. He said, you broke the law. So truth to power and all that. But those standing nearby retorted, this is the ruling priest of God you're insulting. And then Paul says, I was not aware he was the ruling priest. He probably knew, but how could anybody tell this was a priest of God by what he did? So he's kind of insulting him again. I was not aware he was the ruling priest, Paul replied, for it is written, you must not speak evil of your people's ruler. So it's like, my mistake, my bad. Oops, gosh, I didn't know you were the ruling priest. Who could tell? That's just speculation. That's what I think is going on. Then it occurred to Paul that one half of the Sanhedrin was composed of Sadducees and the other of Pharisees. Okay, and I'll have a footnote here to explain more why this matters. So he shouted to the Sanhedrin, folks, brothers and sisters, I am a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. I am being judged because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. So he's making a very good strategic chess move here. Footnote, Paul was using a shrewd tactic to divide the Sanhedrin so he would not be convicted of anything. In other words, there would not be a majority to convict him by dividing them on the basis of something that had really nothing to do with the issue at hand. But technically it could apply. Okay, so he's playing lawyer with them. And he's saying, the footnote goes on, his statement was technically correct, resurrection of the dead. But since the Pharisees believed in this while the Sadducees did not, he knew he could split his opposition right down the middle by not specifying exactly whose resurrection he was on trial for teaching. Paul was smart, and he was playing chess with them and using their own natural division against them. He was driving a wedge between them so they could not, as a body in unity, convict him of anything. So there's a lot of intrigue going on here, and there's more to come. When he said this, there was a great commotion among the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the crowd was split. Mission accomplished. The Sadducees, as parentheses from Luke, the Sadducees say there is no resurrection or messengers, angels, or spirits, but the Pharisees affirm them. So the Sadducees were basically atheists pretty much. They didn't believe in any, they believed technically in God, so maybe they were more agnostic, but they did not believe in anything else supernatural. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. That is, when you die, you stay dead. There's no soul. There's no angels. There's no spirits. And the Pharisees, of course, believed all of that. Okay, then the Sanhedrin, erupted into a shouting match with some of the scripture scholars, the scribes, among the Pharisees contending, we find no grounds for the charges against this person. What if a spirit or messenger spoke to him? So they're trying to make excuses for Paul to the Sadducees. So Paul's got to be sitting back laughing right now. The situation became so volatile that the legion commander feared that Paul might be torn apart by the crowd. So he ordered troops to come down and snatch him away, there's that snatch word again, from them and take him to the citadel for safety. Not for arrest this time, but for safety. But he's still trying to find out whether he should arrest him. That night, the master stood beside him, Paul, and said, take courage, for just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so also you must do in Rome. So Paul's going to get to Rome, not by the route he expected, as I mentioned the other day. As the trial began, the Judeans conspired together because, we couldn't do things legally again. So now, once again, we're going to cheat and go around our own law. Conspired together and bound themselves with an oath that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. I'm guessing they all died of starvation. It doesn't say. This cabal had over 40 members. They went to the ruling priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves with an oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. So here's the plan. Tell the legion commander and the Sanhedrin to take him down to you under the pretext of further interrogation, but we will be ready to kill him before he gets there. So these are the ruling priests and elders who were in on the plot that these other people hatched. They wanted Paul dead anyway, and they were thwarted by Paul's shrewd little move there. And so, yeah, they're all about violating the law whenever it suited them, whenever they could get away with it and out of the public eye. So they're cool with this plan. But it says the son of Paul's sister, that is to say his nephew, heard about the ambush, and he went to the citadel to report it to Paul. So Paul called for one of the Roman army captains and said to him, take this youngster to the legion commander. He has information for him. So he escorted him to the legion commander and reported, the prisoner Paul called me to him and asked me to take this youngster to you because he has something to tell you. The legion commander took him by the hand to speak with him privately and asked, what is it you have to report to me? And he replied, the Judeans have conspired to ask you to take Paul down to the Sanhedrin tomorrow under the pretext that they want more accurate information about him. But don't let them talk you into it, because more than 40 of their men will be waiting in ambush, and they have bound themselves with an oath to neither eat nor drink until they have assassinated him. They are ready now in the expectation that you will agree to this. Then the legion commander dismissed the youngster and warned him, don't tell anyone that you revealed this to me. So there's intrigue on both sides now. We have a counterattack, or not attack, but a plan to thwart the plot. He then summoned 2 Roman army captains and said, prepare 200 soldiers to go as far as Caesarea, along with 70 mounted troops and 200 guards armed with spears. So he's taking this seriously. They are to depart around 9 o'clock tonight, give Paul animals to ride as well, so he will be brought safely to Governor Felix. So he's about to be taken to a Roman governor named Felix to find out what's going on, because this is getting ridiculous. And then he wrote this letter, and this is the funny part I was referring to, from Claudius Lysias. This is the guy's name, the Roman soldier guardian who was in charge of, trying to figure this out. "To most honorable Governor Felix, greetings. This man was apprehended by the Judeans and they were about to kill him, but I came along with the troops and got him out of there when I realized he was a Roman citizen." That is hilarious, because the guy is covering his tracks. He's embellishing the facts in order to impress Felix. He was acting like the Mounties coming in to rescue the damsel tied to the railroad tracks, basically. He's saying that, it isn't exactly the truth. He did come to get Paul out of there, but first he came to arrest him because he assumed he did something wrong. You know the story, we just read it. But he's embellishing things a little bit and making himself look good to Felix. So he was human. Anyway, saying that, I'm the knight in shining armor that came and rescued this fine Roman citizen. In the interest of determining the charges against him, I took him down to their Sanhedrin. It turns out that the indictment concerned questions about their law, but it was certainly nothing deserving of death or imprisonment. Then I was informed about a plot against this man, so I sent him to you at once, and I also demanded that the accusers present their case before you. So he's covering his tracks, padding his resume, so to speak, and he's also bringing Paul safely to this guy for a real trial as opposed to the mock trial that they were planning. So the soldiers followed their orders and took Paul during the night to Antipatris. The next morning, they returned to the citadel while the mounted troops continued on. When they reached Caesarea, they handed over the letter to the governor and presented Paul to him. So that's where Felix was. After reading the letter, he asked what province Paul was from. When he learned that it was Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." Then he ordered him to be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters. Okay, so Luke with his thorough names and places and times and who was in charge and so forth. Okay, so let's go on to chapter 24. There we go. 5 days later, Ananias the ruling priest came down with some elders and an orator by the name of Tertullus, and they presented to the governor their case against Paul. When he was called in, Tertullus began his prosecution. "We've come into a long time of peace through you." He's going to butter up the governor here. "And your foresight has brought many reforms to the nation. In every way and everywhere, most honorable Felix, we accept this with all gratitude," blah, blah, blah. "But in the interest of not taking up too much of your time, I ask that you would be so kind as to listen to us briefly. We have found this man to be a pest and a troublemaker among the Judeans all over the world, as well as a ringleader in the Nazarene sect." So they were calling them the Nazarene sect as well, the Christians. "He even tried to desecrate the temple," which he did not do, of course, "the temple compound as well, so we detained him. Upon examining him yourself, you will be able to verify every charge we're bringing against him." The Judeans agreed, and alleging that these things were true. So they were like, yeah, this is what happened. Then the governor nodded to Paul to speak, and Paul said, since I know you have been judging this nation for many years, I confidently make my defense. You can easily see that no more than 12 days have passed since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, but no one found me arguing with anyone or forming a mob in the temple compound, in the synagogues, or in the city. They can present no evidence to support their accusations. Yet I will admit this to you, that according to this way, which they call a sect, which people today would say cult, I do offer divine service to the God of our ancestors and believe everything written in the law and the prophets. My hope in God, the same as theirs, is in the coming resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. So this touches on the idea that some people believe in annihilation, where the unrighteous will not rise, those just gone. Paul says otherwise. It is in this hope that I continually press on with a clear conscience before God and the people. When some years had passed, I came to do charitable things for my nation and bring offerings. That's when they found me in the temple compound, purified, not with a mob or a riot. And there are some Judeans from the province of Asia who ought to be here to accuse me in your presence if they have any case against me. Otherwise, let these people themselves state what crime they discovered when I stood in front of the Sanhedrin, the one he split, that didn't come to any decision at all. Beyond this one thing I shouted while I stood among them. It is about the resurrection of the dead for which you are judging me today, which was technically true. So he's playing everybody in this scenario. Okay? And then he says, then Felix called to adjourn the court. He was well informed of the details about the way, and he had it. So he was not, living in a vacuum here. He knew about all the goings on with the church. He said, when Lysias, the legion commander, arrives, I will decide your case. He ordered the Roman army captain to put Paul under guard, but to allow him some comfort, including having his friends attend to his needs. After a few days, Felix arrived along with his wife Drusilla. So here's Luke again mentioning women by name, who was a Judean. So Felix's wife is a Jew. That's probably half the reason they're there. But anyway, he sent for Paul and listened to him speak about putting trust or faith in anointed Jesus. But as he gave arguments about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became alarmed and said, "You may go now, and if I have time, I'll call for you." Parentheses that Luke is explaining, he said Felix, he was hoping that Paul would bribe him, which is why he kept sending for him frequently and talking to him with him. Now, when 2 full years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because he wanted to curry favor with the Judeans, he left Paul in custody. So Felix is still political above everything else, guarding his career. And even though he kept sending for Paul periodically over 2 years, letting this thing drag on like you wouldn't believe, he decided to leave him in custody and let the next guy deal with it. Okay, so Festus, we had Felix first, and now we have Festus. And yeah, in the chat regarding annihilationism, that's another topic, but I just wanted to mention that Paul is saying they will rise to be judged. We at least, everybody pretty much agrees upon that, but some people believe they don't even rise. And the Sadducees would be among those people in this account. So now let's go on to chapter 25. 3 days after Festus arrived in the province, people were not in any hurry in those days, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The ruling priests and leading Judeans there informed him of their complaint against Paul, and they asked him a favor. Here they go again. What do you think there is going on when they say they want to transfer Paul to Jerusalem? So Luke tells us here, they had planned to kill him in an ambush along the way. They're trying this again. It failed, but they're going to try it again. But Festus told them that Paul would be kept in Caesarea, though he himself was about to return there at once. And he added, in other words, Festus is going to Jerusalem, but he's leaving Paul in Caesarea. And he added, whoever is able may go with me, and if there is anything about the man that doesn't add up, let them submit a charge. So he's keeping them to the law so far. So he says, after staying with them for no more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day, he took his seat to hold court and summoned Paul to be brought in. So he spent over a week in Jerusalem and then came back. Okay, so when he arrived, the Judeans who came down from Jerusalem stood around him and hurled many serious charges at him, but they could not prove any of them. This is another lesson in the current habit in the conspiracy realm to judge people by nothing but accusations and presumptions instead of actual evidence, such as people who decided that someone famous is a tranny. Sometimes it's obvious. Most of the time it is not, and they need to do, especially with people they haven't seen online, do a DNA test or shut up, in my opinion. That's just needlessly divisive. They think they're heresy hunting, basically, and all they're doing is hurling false accusations, which they themselves would never submit to. And I think they themselves, who accuse everybody else they haven't met of being a tranny, should have their DNA tested and pay for it. Anyway, these people were standing around Paul, hurling serious charges at him, but they couldn't prove even one of them. In his defense, Paul stated, I have committed no crime against the law of the Judeans, against the temple compound, or against Caesar. Now, since Festus wanted to curry favor with the Judeans, this is all the political PC backstroking going on, he responded to Paul by asking, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to face trial there concerning these charges? So he was still going to play that ambush card, even though he didn't know about the ambush. He was saying, he still didn't want to deal with it quite yet. So he said, okay, maybe I'll go along with that request of the Judeans to take Paul back to Jerusalem this time. And Paul said, I am standing in the court of Caesar where I should be judged. Paul replied, I have wronged none of the Judeans, which you know better than anyone. But if I have in fact done wrong and committed something worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. That if there's nothing to these accusations they're bringing against me, no one can hand me over to them as a favor. In other words, he knew this was just a favor to the Jews, and he said, you don't have the right. And he did it. Now he's going to say a very legally binding thing. I appeal to Caesar. This is a big deal when Paul said those words. And this is one I use a lot of times in out of context, but when people say, go ask the pastor, I say, this is an appeal to Caesar. Anyway, Paul has done a very binding legal thing here. And yeah, if those people who took that oath not to eat or drink, like I said, they probably died of starvation by now. So then Festus, after consulting the council to check the law here, said, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. After a few days had passed, King Agrippa, this is another guy, King Agrippa and Bernice, and again, the wife is mentioned, arrived in Caesarea and greeted Festus. After they'd been there for a few days, Festus brought Paul's case to the king's attention. So this is his boss over him. There is a certain man who was left here as a prisoner by Felix. When I came to Jerusalem, the ruling priests and Judean elders brought charges against him and asked for a conviction. But I replied that Romans are not in the habit of surrendering someone as a favor, which he was about to do. So he's covering his behind as well, like the Roman soldier did. He says, but I replied the Romans are not in the habit of surrendering someone as a favor without first giving the accused a chance to face their accuser and give a defense. So he at least technically did that. And give a defense against the charges. So when they gathered in this place, I wasted no time but convened the court the next day and took my seat, and then I summoned them. But when his accusers stood around him, they did not bring up even one of the terrible charges I had expected. Instead, it was all about violations of their own religion, and it concerned a certain Jesus who died but who Paul claimed was alive. Now, since I had no understanding of such questions, I asked whether he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem to face trial over this. But when Paul appeared to have his case examined by the to have his case examined by the imperial court, that is to say the court of Caesar, I ordered that he be held until I can send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear this person myself. You will hear him tomorrow, he replied. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice arrived with much pageantry, entering the audience hall accompanied by legion commanders and prominent citizens. So they had this big parade. At Festus' command, Paul was brought in, and then Festus began to speak. King Agrippa and all the ladies and gentlemen here with us, you see before you this one about whom all the Judeans have interceded with me, both here and in Jerusalem, to be put to death. I determined that he had done nothing worthy of death, but since he appealed to the imperial court, I decided to send him there. But I have nothing specific to write to the sovereign. That is to say, the word sovereign is literally lord or master. He's talking about Caesar, the emperor. Okay, so we've got, change of command like any other secular organization, which the church is not an organization, it's an organism. And what he's saying is that, here's the governor, Festus, who had King Agrippa visiting him, and King Agrippa is under Caesar. Okay, so that's the sovereign, the Lord and Master that they're talking about. He's not talking about the Lord and Master Jesus Christ. He was not a believer. And this is a secular courtroom. So he's saying, I have nothing to write to my Lord, he said, to the sovereign, to the king, the emperor. So I have put him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that through further examination, I might find something to write. For it seems pointless to me to send off a prisoner without listing specific charges against him. In other words, he's not going to send this, he's bound by the law to send Paul to Rome to face Caesar. But he has to have a formal charge, and he hasn't found one yet. So he's in a pickle here, so he's hoping the king can help him out. So now we'll go on to chapter 26. Okay, and then it says, Agrippa told Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. On the matter of charges made against me by the Judeans, King Agrippa, I am pleased to present my defense before you today, especially since you are an expert on the customs and controversies concerning Judaism. Therefore, I humbly ask that you patiently listen to me. So again, this person, even though he came from out of town, knew all about Judaism. Okay? And then Paul goes on, the manner in which I've lived my life from my early youth in my nation as well as in Jerusalem is something the Judeans are well aware of. And having known me before, from the beginning, they would have to admit that I lived as a Pharisee in the strictest sense of the word. And now, because of my hope and the promise that came from God to our ancestors, that I stand on trial. It is because I left out, sorry about that. The 12 tribes of our people offer divine service night and day in the same hope, O king, yet here I am on trial for it. How can you all consider it unbelievable that God should raise the dead? In other words, they all believe in the resurrection of the dead, except the Sadducees. And he's like, how is it that I'm on trial for believing that? He's playing a little bit fast and loose with the technicalities here, but he has every right to do so because he was brought there on false pretenses to begin with. So he's playing their game, and he's saying, okay, if you're going to fight dirty, then so am I. But he's really not even fighting as dirty as they are. They were planning to kill him all the time and using their favors, cashing in their favors with the Roman rulers. But Paul is at least saying, look, these people are hypocrites because they believe in the resurrection of the dead, and yet that's the charge they're bringing against me. That's a very specific resurrection, but a resurrection nonetheless, and they still don't have any right to put him on trial. The Jews don't. So then Paul goes on, I considered it my duty as a Pharisee, to commit many acts against the name of Jesus the Nazarene, including in Jerusalem. I even locked up many of the holy ones in jail, having obtained jurisdiction from the ruling priest, and I voted in favor of the death penalty. I pursued them in the synagogues. He wasn't content to deal with Jerusalem. He went out hounding them to punish them and force them to commit slander against God. This is what blasphemy is, slander against God. I was in such an insane rage against them that I also persecuted them in foreign cities. So he knew he was blind with rage when he was doing this. And this is what happens when people don't like the truth. They go into a blind, insane rage. During one such persecution, Paul said, I was on my way to Damascus with the jurisdiction and permission of the ruling priest. And this is what I've been mentioning, the third account of his experience on the road to Damascus. First one was narrated by Luke. The second one is what Paul said before the Sanhedrin, I think it was. And then this is the third one before King Agrippa. He says, while on the road around noon, O king, a light from heaven brighter than the sun shone all around me and my traveling companions. When we all dropped to the ground, I heard a voice say to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Resistance is futile. I had to put that in. It's perfectly legitimate translation, but I had to put that in. That's what Jesus said. It's an idiomatic equivalent of it is hard for you to kick against the goads, as when a horse resists the spurs of the rider. So a horse has nothing to, can't do much about it when they're being spurred by the rider, and so resistance is futile. I had to put that in. That's what I do. Anyway, he said, who are you, sir? Paul is relating his experience where he said to Jesus, who are you? And the reply, I am Jesus. He answered, the one you're persecuting. Now get up and stand on your feet, because the reason I appeared to you is that you were prepared in advance to be a slave and a witness, both of what you have seen and what I will show you. I will set you apart from the Judeans as well as from the non-Judeans, to whom I am commissioning you. So Jesus himself sent Paul to the Gentiles. You are to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light, and from the jurisdiction of the adversary to that of God. And this is what I've talked about many times. We are in the kingdom of Satan. That's this phrase right here. And he's saying we're turning from that kingdom to the kingdom of God. And this is what Jesus himself said to Paul. And well done, and there in the chat with the icons and all. You are to turn people from darkness to light, from the kingdom of Satan to that of God, and to obtain for them an acquittal for their failures and inheritance along with those who have been made holy by faith in me. And that's the end of the quote of Jesus that Paul made before in a court of law, formal court of law before King Agrippa. Okay, it says, King Agrippa, I did not react to this heavenly vision with hostility. So there he is. There's the choice. People will say up to this point, no, you're stretching things. You're seeing what you want to see. Regarding the issue of Calvinistic interpretation, which says God chose him for salvation. But Paul's statement here makes no sense if that's true. Because Paul is saying, I did not react with hostility. He could have, or there's no point in saying it. He did not say, I had no choice but to do what Jesus was telling me. He's saying, I didn't react with hostility. So there's the clincher of anybody who wants to use this experience of Paul to say that God picks and chooses who to save. This puts a nail in that coffin. So anyway, he says, but I went at once to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem, to those throughout the province of Judea, and to the non-Judeans. I proclaimed that they must change their minds, that is, repent and turn back to God and then live accordingly. That's the part that most Christians don't get, live accordingly. It was on this account that the Judeans took hold of me to arrest me when I was in the temple compound. But because God has come to my aid to this day, even though he's been through a lot of trouble, he says God has pulled him through it this far. I stand here testifying to both the lowly and the exalted, that is to say, the common people and the royal court. I have said nothing beyond what Moses and the prophets said would happen, that the anointed would suffer, and that as the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light to the Judeans and non-Judeans alike. He's saying, I'm fulfilling the scriptures. They got no grounds to complain against me, either under Roman law or Judaic law. As he was presenting his defense, Festus, not King Agrippa, but Festus shouted, "You're insane, Paul. Too much education has driven you mad." Whoa. Isn't that what we're hearing today in the conspiracy realm? Education is bad. It's not bad. It's only bad to people who don't want to hear what you have to say. Now, the educational system as a paradigm is bad. Its design is to indoctrinate, not educate. We're talking about real education, the kind that people are doing when they seek truth. And in Paul's case, he also had a formal education. There's nothing wrong with that either, because you take everything as in its context. And as someone who's been to college myself, I can tell you most of what they say, as far as the technical issues in science and that sort of thing that I went to college for, is true. Okay, the hard sciences. I'm not talking about the speculation of interpreting long ages or cosmology or any of the other magic stories that people tell in college. I'm talking about the real stuff. So you have to know and discern the true from the false wherever you go, and that includes education. Anyway, Paul was educated, and Festus said he was so educated that Festus decided that Paul was losing his mind, which is ridiculous. But Festus is just exasperated and doesn't want to hear what Paul's saying. That's how people react to the truth sometimes. On the contrary, great Festus, Paul replied, I am speaking divinely given rational truth. Since the king is adept at what I've been talking about, the king, he's talking to Festus about the king. Since the king is adept at what I've been talking about so boldly, I'm sure that none of this has escaped his notice. This whole affair did not happen in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Do you think that you can persuade me to become a Christian in such a short time? Agrippa asked Paul. Short time or long, Paul replied, my intent before God is not only you, but all who have heard me today will become as I am, except for these chains. And this should be the Christian's bold witness or testimony. And by the way, testimony or witness and martyr are both the same word in Greek, marturion. Both, you can take it as a witness or a martyr. And context is the only thing you have to go on to tell you which it means. So anyway, there's that word Christian, and let's look at the footnote here. And that's just the same one we made it on Acts 11:26. This is one of the many, or one of the three, I think, instances where the word Christian does in fact appear in the New Testament in the Greek text. Okay, and it is a Christ follower. Okay, Christianos. So Agrippa says, you really think you're going to make me a Christian in such a short time? And Paul says, I hope so. Then the king, the governor, Bernice, there's that woman name again, and those sitting with them stood up, and as they left the court, they said to each other, this person has done nothing worthy of the death penalty imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, he could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar. So that's how serious that statement of Paul was. They were ready to let him go, but Paul wrote his own death sentence basically by saying, no, I appeal to Caesar. They couldn't get out of it. They were obeying their own law, unlike the Jews who were violating every tenet of it. And so Paul's going to go to Rome, whether, this is how God works through people. And it isn't as though anybody's will was forced. It's just how God works things out. Okay, so chapter 27, we're almost done here, and it's only been an hour. How about that? When it was determined that we were to sail off to Italy, and this is going to be an adventure, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a Roman army captain named Julius of the imperial division. So there's more technical details that Luke is providing. We boarded a ship from whatever it was, Adamantium, another sci-fi reference, which was about to depart for stops along the coast of the province of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. So common names and places here that anybody can look up if they want to really dig. On another day, we were taken down to Sidon. Julius was kind to Paul and allowed him to visit friends to care for his needs. So even though he was a prisoner, he was given a lot of slack. Setting out from there, we sailed near the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Then we went out to the open sea off Cilicia and Pamphylia, then down to Myra of Lycia. The Roman army captain found an Alexandrian ship there, which was headed for Italy, and he put us on board. Sailing was very slow for many days, so Luke is describing in very great detail his own experiences here as well. And we were barely able to reach whatever that is, Cnidus, but the winds were unfavorable for us to leave there, so we sailed along the lee of Crete across from Salome. We sailed along the coast with great difficulty till we came to a place called Fair Harbors near the city of Lycia. Now, since so much time had passed and sailing was already hazardous, and since Paul had already missed the fast, I'll check the footnote in a second, he pleaded with them, gentlemen, it seems to me that sailing is going to result in much damage and loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives. Let me check the footnote here for a second on the fast. What fast is Paul talking about? The Day of Atonement, celebrated in the fall. They're getting close to winter. The seas are getting choppy. And that's the fast he's talking about. So he's saying, let's not, Paul was already upset that so much time had passed that he had missed it. Jews don't like missing their festival days. And he was still a Jew after all. And there was things, anytime there was an event like that going on, he always going to see everything as an opportunity to spread the gospel and save his own people who he cared deeply about still. So he's trying to say, look, it's bad weather. Let's stick around and not, take the risk. But the Roman army captain was persuaded by the navigator and the one who chartered the ship over what Paul had said. The harbor was unfit for making berth for the winter, so the majority decided to set out from there in the hope that they might be able to spend the winter at Phoenix. It was a harbor at Crete which faced both northwest and southwest, and when a gentle south wind came up, they thought they had what they were looking for, so they weighed anchor and stayed near the coast along Crete. And you can go to that map page if we want to look at where these places are. That's always helpful when you're just reading through this stuff. It's like, just words going in one ear and out the other, but if you have a map, it's a little more interesting. Anyway, this is all historical evidence and very well established. And Luke, again, is not trying to hide anything or make up a story. Otherwise, he wouldn't name these things and these people. Not long afterwards, a violent wind of hurricane force called a northeaster slammed into the island. The ship was caught up in it and could not face the wind, so we just let the wind carry it along. We came under the lee of a small island called Cauda or something like that, but we were barely able to secure the lifeboat. When they had hoisted it aboard, they ran ropes to reinforce the ship. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars off Syrtis, they lowered the anchor and we were driven along. But we were so violently tossed around by the storm that they jettisoned the cargo the next day. So this was bad. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. It was severe. When neither sun nor stars appeared for another 4 days due to the continuing storm, we were robbed of all hope of being rescued. So Paul warned them. He was probably saying, I told you so, in the Hebrew dialect or something. I don't know. But anyway, that's what happened. After they had gone without food for a long time, Paul stood among them and said, Gentlemen, you should have listened to me when I told you not to set out from Crete, so you could have avoided this damage and loss. But now I urge you to cheer up, because not one life among you will be lost, but only the ship. Last night a messenger of the God I belong to, and to whom I offer divine service, stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. So God has favored you by granting you the lives of everyone sailing with you. So cheer up, gentlemen, for I trust God that it will happen just as I have been told. However, we must run aground on some island. So he was given a prophetic word about this. On the 14th night, we were still being driven all over the Adriatic Sea, when around midnight the sailors sensed that we were approaching land. So they took a sounding, and it measured 20 fathoms deep. And when they took another one a while later, it measured 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might crash against the rocks, they pitched 4 anchors off the stern on the presumption that daylight was approaching. Now some of the sailors tried to escape the ship by lowering the lifeboat to the sea under the pretext of dropping anchors from the bow. But Paul warned the Roman army captain and the soldiers, if any of these don't stay with the ship, none of you will be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drop. When it was almost dawn the next day, Paul encouraged everyone to eat something. Today marks the 14th day that you've eaten nothing because of worry. So I urge you all to eat something in order to preserve yourselves, for not a hair on your heads will be lost. Having said this, Paul took some bread and thanked God for it in front of them, then broke it and began to eat. This made them all take heart and eat. The total number of people on board the ship was 276. So this was not some little rowboat. And when they were full, they lightened the ship further by tossing the grain into the sea. When it was light enough to see land, they did not recognize it, but they noticed a bay with a beach and thought they might be able to run the ship aground there. So they let the anchors slip while also loosening the ropes. So this is very detailed nautical terminology Luke is using here. Loosening the ropes on the rudders, and then hoisted the foresail to catch the wind and head for the beach. But when they got to a channel where 2 seas met, the bow ran aground and was stuck firmly, while the stern was being broken apart by the force of the waves. The bow, of course, being the front, and the stern named after the steering, which was at the back, the paddle at one side. That's why starboard is on the right. That's where the steering board was, on the right. So the port side was the left, because you didn't want to put your paddle that you're steering with on the side where it would be scraped and broken by the dock. So that's why the left is the port side. Anyway, my dad was in the Navy, my sister-in-law was in the Navy, and my husband was in the Navy. So there you go. Anyway, the soldiers decided that they should kill the prisoners so that no one could swim out and escape. But the Roman army captain was determined to bring Paul safely through, and he thwarted their plans. In addition, he ordered that those who could swim were to dive off first and go to land, while others would use planks or other parts of the ship, so everyone made it safely to land. A lot of interesting stuff there, and the nautical terms, like everything else Luke does, shows him to be a very thorough and careful historian. So here again, I defy anybody else's religious writings and stories to compare with the matter-of-fact method of the New Testament. So, last chapter of Acts. When we had come safely through, we found out that the island was called Melita, or something like that, however you pronounce it. The people there showed us unusual kindness, kindling a fire and taking us in due to the rain and cold. So not only did they have all that to go through, it decided to rain. But as Paul twisted together a bundle of kindling and put it on the fire, a poisonous snake came away from the heat and fastened itself to his hand. Now, when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This person must certainly be a murderer. Though he came safely out of the sea, justice will not let him live." So there's that capitalized justice because it's being personified there. It's a literary device, not saying that justice is a literal being. People make that mistake. Anyway, but Paul shook it off and into the fire without suffering any harm. Then they were expecting him to swell up or drop dead. So these people were not idiots. They knew a poisonous snake when they saw one, and what always happens when people are bit by one. And so they expected that to happen here. But after waiting quite a while without incident, they decided instead that he must be a god. So from one extreme to the other, you're not a murderer, you're a god. They'd never seen anything like this. The land nearby belonged to the leader of the island, whose name was Publius. He welcomed us kindly and lodged us for 3 days. Now, it happened that Publius' father was bedridden with a fever and dysentery, but Paul came to him, and after praying and placing his hand on him, miraculously healed him. After this happened, the rest of the islanders with infirmities came and were cured. They gave us many honors, and when it came time to set sail, they supplied our needs. So everything happens for a reason. After 3 months, we set out on an Alexandrian ship. Sorry about the buffering in the chat. I don't know why it's happening. I set everything to minimize that as much as possible. Sorry about that. Eventually it'll catch up, I hope. I don't see it buffering right now, but hopefully that will clear up for you. Anyway, after 3 months, we set out on an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of Castor and Pollux. These are the twins. We'll check the footnote here. Castor and Pollux were the sons of Zeus, Roman Jupiter. Jupiter is Zeus. Okay? Just Greek and Roman names. Castor and Pollux were the sons of Zeus. Okay? And here again, if the Bible is trying to confuse Jesus with Zeus or adopting his name and saying he is Zeus, it's doing the poorest job of it because, like I said before, Zeus's name has come up in the book of Acts prior, and here we have a ship with the names of his twin sons, which Castor and Pollux, there's a constellation that you can go look at. That's what they were named after. And so here again, this mitigates against the argument, the claim, the ridiculous false charge that Jesus is Zeus or some such nonsense. Okay, so anyway, this ship with that figurehead wintered at the island, and after landing at Syracuse, we stayed for 3 days and circled around to arrive at Rhegium, I guess it is. When the south wind came up the next day, we reached some other place. The day after, we found some believers there who invited us to stay with them for 7 days. Then we finally came to Rome. So they did get there. It was a very convoluted route, but they got there. Okay? And the believers there had heard about us and came to meet us as far as the AP Forum and 3 taverns. So these were places you can, I actually looked these up. These are real places that existed then. The 3 taverns was not just 3 taverns. It was a watering hole in the larger sense of the word where caravans met and such. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. And when we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to live on his own along with the soldier assigned to guard him. So he's under house arrest, but they were keeping him on a long leash because they knew there was nothing to the charges, but they had to bring him to trial anyway. Now it happened that 3 days later, Paul, called together the leaders of the Judeans. When they arrived, he said to them, "Folks and fellow believers, I, who have done nothing contrary to our people or traditions, was taken prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. They tried me and intended to release me, since there was no basis for the death penalty against me. But when the Judeans spoke against me, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had any complaint against my people." In other words, he's saying, look, I wasn't trying to get my own people, the Jews, in trouble. I just was trying to survive. This is the reason I called you here, to see you and speak to you, because I am in chains due to the hope of Israel. But they responded, we have not received any letters about you from Judea, and none of the believers that have come along have said anything good or bad about you. But we still want to hear your thoughts about this sect, which is being spoken against everywhere. So they were aware of general criticisms of Christians in general, as far as this being a sect or cult that had broken away from Judaism. That's what they're hearing against it. Not that Christians were bad people, but that the Jews didn't like them. Okay, so they've heard some things and some rumors, but nothing about him specifically, so they wanted to hear more. A day was set for a meeting, and even more people came to where he was staying. He expounded, because he couldn't leave, he was under house arrest. He expounded and testified about the kingdom of God from morning till evening, persuading them about Jesus from both the law of Moses and the prophets. So that's the value of the law and the prophets, especially for the Jews, is to convince them that Jesus was the Messiah. And what did the Jews do? As I've said before, they tried to hide messianic prophecies in their Masoretic translation or text of Hebrew, which all the modern translations are based on. So, there they are again, monkeying around with things. But anyway, some were indeed convinced by what Paul said, and while others were not. They disagreed among themselves and were dismissed after Paul made this one declaration. The Holy Spirit truly spoke through Isaiah the prophet to your ancestors. And this is the beginning of the quote. Go to this people and say, you always hear but never understand. You always see but never perceive. For these people's minds are callous, their ears are plugged, they squint with their eyes. Otherwise, they might see clearly, listen intently, and understand completely. Then I would turn around and heal them. So God is not, again, saying, as the Calvinists would say, would twist, that God blinds people so they can't accept the gospel. He's saying that because they plug their ears and close their eyes, that God hardens them. That's I've been over that many times before. So then he's saying to the people who didn't accept this, the Jews who rejected their Messiah, again, let it be known to you, in verse 28, let it be known to you then that this salvation of God was sent to the non-Judeans, and they will listen. And this, of course, Paul knows what's going to happen. People get very, very upset when he says things like that to Jews. But there's a verse 29 there that I left blank because it's not in the original earliest text. And that's, if you want to read more about my translation choices, omitting verses, so-called, which really means not putting in the added verses that the King James put, you can read the preface for that. So verse 30, Paul stayed there for 2 whole years in his own rented house. He welcomed all who came to him and proclaimed the kingdom of God, teaching about Master Jesus, the anointed and unhindered and with great boldness. So that's the end of the story. That's where Luke's account ends. And through other historical studies, we put it together that Paul was eventually put on trial, and because I think it was Nero who was in charge by then, was of course not an upstanding citizen of exemplary character, to put it mildly, and he would have put Paul to death by the method of any Roman citizen, which Paul was, which is beheading, which is considered a humane death because they didn't slowly saw your head off the way the Muslims do. They just chopped it quickly. So it was a humane execution. And that's probably most likely everybody of any study believes that Paul was beheaded in Rome at the order of Nero. So that's Luke's extended historical account of the Acts of the Apostles. And we're going to see part of Luke's gospel starting next week when I cover the Gospels. And I'm going to cover them synoptically, which means as a whole, as the 4 together, because it's A, so rarely done, and B, it helps put things in better context. And going through every gospel in order would be extremely tedious, and even my 5 viewers would stop coming, I think. But anyway, Acts was a really much more interesting book in its context than most people will get just by listening to snippets on a Sunday morning. The churches don't have a continuity that they've tried to get by having canned lessons in quarterlies that they produce at publishing houses by various people, and that's all well and good when you don't have a lot of trained people. And to be a teacher in most Sunday schools, you just need a warm body who can read and follow lesson plans. And I'm not saying that as much to diss the teachers, because most of them have very good intentions and are sincere in wanting to do the work of God, and it does take some work just to do that. But this isn't the kind of teaching that Christians need. We need to move on from the children's stories and dig in deep to these things and put them in context and note the fact that the reason all this tedious detail was given about nautical terms and places and what the ship was doing and all that, this is evidence that could be used in a trial. And we're going to get to that next week, because that's what the Gospels have to have. They have to have evidence. This is an evidence-based faith. And so this is consistent with that. Luke is a very good historian, as I've said many times, and I'm not just me. This isn't just my opinion. This is the opinion of scholars, even secular ones, that Luke is a good historian. So this is the account of the early church, and there were a lot of lessons to learn in it. And I'm glad that, for all its faults, YouTube/Google has made this possible. Otherwise, I'd be talking to my walls. And not a lot more people than that, but still, it's more. And this medium, bad and secular as the world is, we have to make use of what we have. I mean, that's what Paul did all those times. He made use of his Roman citizenship. He used it, his Judaic credentials as a Pharisee. He used whatever he could to get the gospel forward. And so we have to also not only realize that we have that to use at our disposal as well, but also to not be so quick to pounce on another Christian that's doing that sort of thing in a way that we might think is not appropriate. So just, that doesn't mean it's always appropriate. This just means we need to treat each other as Christians a little better and more patiently, and try to work through these things through the examples we have here in the New Testament to go by. So next time we will go to the Gospels, and I'll just jump over here quickly to the outline, because I'm going to mostly look at that. Because as you see here, I have everything listed separately except the Gospels in the commentary. Now I have them translated separately in the English text here. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But here in the commentary, it's going to be all four together, and I'll explain more why about that next week. So, yeah, it's possible in time. I don't have a lot of viewers. Most of them are under 50 views on my videos. But who knows whether that number is accurate. But at the same time, it's the same inaccurate numbers that other people have, and, with thousands of views. But, patience. I have to do that too. So even if it isn't a large number, at least, if it mattered to somebody, it's like I've said before about that illustration of the boy trying to rescue newly hatched turtles on the beach. He can't rescue them all, but it matters to the ones he found and picked up and got safely to the water. So anyway, it's a starvation diet sometimes, but we keep going. Let's say in the chat, yeah, about taking off work and things. I know that's really awesome of you to want to do, but at the same time, don't jeopardize too much. I mean, these are recorded, so it's not like you won't get to hear them at all. And there is someone I need to speak to after I close this down. I'm gonna, if you're listening, person who's gonna speak to me privately after this, I'll need a short break. I'll get with you, back to my computer after 5 or 10 minutes and see if you're around. So anyway, and I appreciate all of you coming, and yeah, turtles in the chat. I really do. And we're actually almost done with our New Testament walkthrough. And like I said, the Gospels I'm going to treat a little differently because they are 4 accounts of the same thing, and it's a really important thing. And it needs that context. So I'm done for today. And an hour and a half seems to be my limit anymore, with my voice is starting to go on me again. So I will take a break, get me some tea, and get back to my computer after that. So thanks again. See you guys later. And we'll get to the Gospels next week.